They say the mountains don't remember names, but they never met the golden predator that visits my porch every dawn. I have spent 72 years breathing the thin, sharp air of the Cascade Mountains. But nothing in my career as a civil engineer prepared me for the debt I now collect every morning. My name is Silas Thorne. At my age, most men seek the comfort of a fireplace and a quiet life, but my peace is interrupted by the rhythmic thud of a 150-pound mountain lion leaping onto my wooden deck. His name is Cooper. He doesn't come for blood, and he doesn't come for a fight. He comes to pay. Right now, as the first light of dawn bleeds through the Douglas firs, Cooper is standing less than 3 feet from my window. His amber eyes, cold and piercing, lock onto mine with an intensity that would freeze the heart of any seasoned hunter. He drops it a single withered maple leaf, stained a deep crimson. It flutters to the floorboards, joining a small pile of others, just like it. This is his currency. This is his ritual. But this morning something is wrong. Cooper's fur is matted, and his usual low purr has been replaced by a sharp, agitated twitch of his tail. He's not just here to pay today, he's here to warn me. The valley is no longer ours alone. Behind him, down the winding dirt road that leads to my secluded cabin, the aggressive roar of an engine echoes through the trees, a sound that doesn't belong in this wilderness. Men with cold hearts and high-tech scopes are closing in, led by a man who thinks everything in this world has a price tag. They are coming for the land, but they stay for the trophy. They have no idea that this beast isn't just an animal. He is a guardian with a memory longer than any human grudge. I watched Cooper grow from a dying cub into the shadow of the mountain, and now, as the shadow of a black SUV creeps toward my fence, the real hunt is about to begin. CTA. Before we dive into the secret behind this strange ritual and the danger looming over the valley, please tell me, what time is it where you are, and which city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story of loyalty has traveled across the world. If you believe that a wild heart can be more faithful than a human one, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment below. If a mountain lion stood at your door today, would you run for your life or stay to see what he brought you? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. 10 winters ago, the snow didn't just fall. It buried the world in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my chest. The Cascades had transformed into a fortress of white and ice, a landscape where the boundary between life and death was as thin as a single frost-covered needle. I remember standing by the window of my cabin watching the spruce trees bend under the impossible load of the storm, their branches groaning like rusted hinges. That night the wind didn't just howl, it screamed with a primal hunger that seemed to claw at the very foundations of my home. I was 62 then, still possessing the restless energy of a man who had built bridges across canyons. Yet the mountain always reminded me that nature held the ultimate blueprints. It was during a brief lull in the blizzard, a momentary pause where the world held its breath, that I heard it a sound so fragile it barely registered above the crackle of my fireplace. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the settling of timber. It was a high-pitched rhythmic rasp, a desperate plea for air and life that pierced through the frozen dark. I grabbed my heavy wool coat and a high-powered flashlight, stepping out into a world where the air burned my lungs like inhaled glass. The beam of light cut through the swirling flakes, dancing over the deep drifts, until it landed on a jagged outcrop of rock near the edge of the ravine. There, half submerged in the powder, was a sight that halted the blood in my veins. A mountain lion cub no more than a few months old was thrashing against a cruel, rusted, jagged-toothed steel trap. The metal was clamped deep around its small shoulder, the orange rust stark against its pale, tawny fur. It was Cooper, though, back then. He was just a nameless bundle of fur and terror. His eyes, even then a striking amber, were wide, with an agony I can still feel in my own bones today. The ground around the trap was stained, a dark, frozen crimson, a silent testimony to his hours of struggle. I knew the danger. Even a wounded cub has claws like razors, and a desperate mother might be lurking just beyond the shadows of the pines. But the engineering mind in me saw only a problem that needed a solution, and the human heart saw a soul that deserved a chance. I approached slowly, my boots sinking waist-deep into the drifts, whispering steady, low-frequency words that were meant more to calm my own racing pulse than his. The cub bared its tiny teeth, a hiss of defiance that ended in a weak, gurgling cough. I shed my heavy coat and threw it over his head, a makeshift shroud to dampen his panic and protect my arms from his frantic strikes. Kneeling in the biting snow, I felt the intense cold seeping through my trousers, but I couldn't stop. My hands, calloused from decades of handling steel and stone, fumbled with the frozen tension of the trap's spring. The iron was stubborn, fused by ice, and years of neglect acting like a hungry jaw that refused to let go of its prize. I had to use a crowbar I'd brought along, wedging it between the teeth of the device, every muscle in my shoulders screaming as I applied pressure. The metal groaned, a metallic shriek that echoed off the canyon walls, and finally the tension snapped. The cub went limp, the sudden release of pain overwhelming his tiny system. I didn't hesitate. I scooped up the bundle of fur and coat, cradling him against my chest to share what little warmth I had left, and fought my way back through the deepening whiteout toward the garage. The air inside the garage was sharp with the scent of oil, old sawdust, and cold concrete, but it was a sanctuary compared to the abyss outside. I cleared a space on my workbench, laying him down under the warm glow of a shop light. His breathing was shallow, his heartbeat a frantic, irregular drum against my palms. I spent the next 4 hours working with the precision of a man who had once calculated the load-bearing capacity of a 1,000-ton suspension bridge. I cleaned the wound with warm water and antiseptic, watching the water turn pink as it washed away the mountain's cruelty. His shoulder was mangled, the bone miraculously intact, but the muscle torn in a way that would leave a permanent mark on his spirit and his gait. I fashioned a splint from lightweight cedar and wrapped the limb in clean gauze, my fingers moving with a gentleness I hadn't known I possessed. For the first 3 days he stayed in a large wooden crate lined with old blankets, a fierce little ghost in the corner of my workshop. I fed him small scraps of raw venison from my freezer, sliding the meat through the slats with a pair of long tongs. He didn't eat at first. He just watched me with those piercing amber eyes, evaluating the man who had stolen him from the mountain and given him back his life. By the 4th day, the meat disappeared within seconds of hitting the floor of the crate. There was no gratitude in those early days, only a wary, calculated truce. I spoke to him every evening, sharing stories of the bridges I'd built and the rivers I'd crossed, the sound of my voice acting as a bridge itself between 2 very different worlds. As the weeks passed and the snow outside began to recede, exposing the dark earth beneath the wound on his shoulder, closed into a thick, hairless scar, the mark that would forever identify him as the survivor he was. He began to move, with a slight hitch in his stride, a permanent reminder of the iron's bite. I knew the time was coming to let him go, to return the wild to the wild. The morning I opened the garage door, the spring air was sweet, with the scent of melting snow and budding pine. Cooper stood at the threshold for a long time, his nose twitching as he took in the vastness of the Cascades. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a sign. He simply vanished into the tree line like a wisp of smoke, a tawny shadow reclaiming its kingdom. I stood there for a long time. The silence of the forest, feeling different than it had before, no longer empty, but filled with a presence I couldn't see. I figured that was the end of our story, a brief intersection of paths on a frozen night. I expected the mountain to swallow him whole, and I expected to return to my quiet life of blueprints and solitude. I didn't realize then that the debt forged in iron and blood was one that the mountain never forgets, and that some bonds are tempered in the coldest fires. For months I saw no sign of him, not a single print in the mud or a tuft of fur on the wire. I went about my routines, fixing the shingles on the roof and preparing for the next cycle of seasons, but I found myself looking toward the tree line more often than I cared to admit. The solitude of the cabin felt sharper, now the absence of that fierce little heartbeat in the garage, leaving a hollow space in the rhythm of my days. Then on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, I walked out onto the porch to find something that defied every law of nature I understood. Resting squarely in the center of my welcome mat was a single, perfect elk shed, the antler still smelling of the deep forest. There were no tracks nearby, no sound of a retreat, just the gift itself. It was the first sign that the cub I saved hadn't just survived, he had remembered. He was out there watching from the shadows, a golden ghost who had decided that our contract wasn't yet fulfilled. The iron had tried to take his life, but my hands had given it back, and in the unspoken language of the wild, that was a transaction that required a lifetime of repayment. I sat on the edge of the porch, running my fingers over the rough texture of the antler, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man waiting for the end of his days. I felt like a man who had been chosen. Wild things aren't supposed to have memories for kindness. Yet Cooper began to prove every textbook wrong, one leaf at a time. The transition from the desperate cub I had mended in my garage to the apex predator that now reclaimed the Cascades was a silent, slow-motion explosion of power and grace. As the seasons bled into one another, the elk antler I had found on my porch was no longer a solitary mystery, but the opening chapter of a long, unspoken dialogue. My mornings adopted a new sacred geometry centered around the heavy wooden porch where I had spent so many decades drinking coffee in solitude. Now that solitude was shared with a ghost. Cooper had grown into a magnificent specimen of feline engineering, his muscles rippling under a coat, the color of toasted, tawny silk, and that jagged scar on his shoulder served as his badge of survival. He did not approach like a pet, nor did he linger like a beggar. He moved with the calculated weight of a king visiting a neighboring province. The ritual was always the same, occurring in that fragile hour when the sun struggled to crest the jagged peaks of the mountains. I would hear the distinct heavy thud of his landing, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep in my marrow. Through the glass I watched him stand perfectly still, his amber eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of intrusion before he focused on me. In his mouth, held with a gentleness that defied the killing power of his jaws, would be a leaf. Sometimes it was the broad golden hand of a big leaf maple, other times the serrated crimson of a vine maple, or even the waxen green of an evergreen shrub during the harshest stretches of January. He would place the leaf precisely on the welcome mat, a deliberate act of payment for the slab of elk meat or venison I left in a heavy iron dish nearby. This wasn't the behavior of a domestic animal seeking affection, it was a trade, a sophisticated system of bartering, established by a creature that understood the concept of balance better than most men. I realized quickly that to reach out and pet him would be a violation of this unspoken contract, an insult to his dignity as a wild sovereign. We were two old souls inhabiting the same rugged corner of the world, acknowledging a debt that had shifted from a life saved to a mutual respect maintained through the currency of the forest. The meat I provided was a supplement, a gift of ease in a harsh landscape, and the leaves were his way of ensuring the scales remained even. My life as an engineer had taught me that every structure requires a foundation of equal forces, and Cooper was providing the counterweight to my presence in his territory. This quiet equilibrium became the heartbeat of my existence. A secret shared between a man with a silver beard and a mountain lion with a scarred shoulder. However, the mountain began to feel smaller as the outside world started to press against its borders. It started with small, nearly imperceptible changes, the snap of a dry twig where no deer should be, or the glint of something metallic hidden within the dense thicket of huckleberry bushes. My senses, sharpened by years of listening to the subtle shifts of the wilderness, began to register a new kind of silence, one that felt forced and artificial. I noticed Cooper's behavior changing first. His visits became shorter, his eyes darting toward the lower ridges with an intensity that signaled a different kind of threat. One afternoon, while checking the perimeter of my fence, I found the first physical evidence of the intrusion. Tucked into the fork of an ancient cedar tree was a trail camera, a high-end model encased in professional-grade camouflage. It wasn't the kind of equipment used by local hunters or the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was a piece of high-tech surveillance gear capable of transmitting images via satellite. The realization hit me with the force of a winter gale. Someone was tracking us, documenting the impossible bond I had kept hidden from the world. A few days later, while scanning the distant ridgeline with my binoculars, I caught the unmistakable flash of a long-range telephoto lens. The light hit the glass and bounced back, a momentary spark of glass and steel that didn't belong in the organic chaos of the Cascades. These were the eyes of the vulture, the observers who sought to capture the wild, not for protection but for possession. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach as I understood the implications. To the world beyond these mountains, Cooper was a trophy, a statistical anomaly, or a viral sensation waiting to happen. To the men behind those lenses, he was a commodity to be exploited, a prize to be displayed on a wall or a screen. I began to see the shadows moving more frequently now. The silhouettes of men who walked with the heavy, uncoordinated steps of those who viewed the forest as a playground rather than a sanctuary. They were encroaching on the sacred space where a leaf was worth more than gold, and I knew the peace Silas Thorne had cultivated was about to be shattered. The air in the Thung Lung felt charged with an invisible electricity, the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. I watched Cooper from the window that evening, noticing how he tasted the air. His lip curled in a silent snarl as he caught a scent that was entirely human and entirely wrong. He dropped a withered oak leaf onto the mat, but his eyes never left the dark curtain of trees behind him. There was no purr this time, only a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The debt forged in iron was about to be tested by a new kind of metal, and the leaves of the Cascades were being trampled by boots that had no business being here. I reached out and touched the glass, a futile gesture of protection for the golden ghost on the other side. The mountain was no longer our private fortress. It had become a stage, and the audience was closing in with hungry eyes. I spent that night poring over old topographical maps, my mind racing through the logistics of defense, wondering how a man of 72 could protect a creature of the wild from the sophisticated greed of his own kind. Every creak of the cabin's timber sounded like a footstep, every rustle of the wind like a whispered conspiracy. Cooper didn't return to the forest immediately that night. He crouched on the edge of the deck, a statuesque guardian, carved from muscle and shadow, waiting for the first sign of the coming storm. The currency of nature was being devalued by the arrival of men who understood nothing of loyalty or balance, and I realized that the leaves were more than just payment. They were a desperate, beautiful attempt to hold onto a world that was being sold out from under us. The lenses were out there, cold and unblinking, waiting for the moment the predator made a mistake, and I vowed that they would have to go through Silas Thorne first. Our quiet ritual had become a target, and the silence of the Cascades was now a countdown. The peaceful hum of the wilderness was shattered by the aggressive roar of a black SUV that didn't belong on these dirt roads. The sound was a jagged tear in the fabric of the Cascades, a mechanical intrusion that sent the local blue jays into a frantic, scolding chorus. I stood on my porch, my hand resting on the weathered cedar railing as the dust cloud settled to reveal a vehicle that cost more than my entire cabin. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been surgically removed from a high-rise office in Seattle and dropped into the mud. He was Julian Vane, a name that carried the cold, sterile weight of hedge funds and aggressive acquisitions, though I wouldn't know the full extent of his reputation until much later. He wore a designer jacket that had never seen a day of real outdoor work, and his smile was a calculated arrangement of porcelain that didn't reach his eyes. Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He walked toward me with the stride of someone who assumed every square inch of the earth was already listed in his portfolio. He looked around at the towering Douglas firs and the pristine Thung Lung with a gaze that didn't see beauty, but rather timber-board feet and potential resort square footage. The air seemed to grow thinner in his presence, polluted by the faint, cloying scent of expensive cologne and the invisible pressure of a man who viewed silence as an obstacle to be overcome. He started talking before his boots even hit the first step of my porch, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that felt like oil on water. He spoke of progress of development and of a vision for a world-class private hunting and eco-resort that would put this forgotten corner of the world on the map. I listened without interruption, my silence a wall he kept trying to climb with taller and taller piles of money. He produced a leather-bound folder flipping through topographical maps where my home was marked as a minor obstruction to be cleared for a luxury clubhouse. When I finally spoke, telling him that my land was not for sale and that the mountains didn't care for his vision, his smile didn't falter, but the temperature of the conversation dropped 10 degrees. It was at that precise moment that the air shifted and the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I felt a familiar presence watching from the shadows of the hemlocks. Julian Vane noticed the change in my posture and followed my gaze, reaching into his jacket to pull out a pair of high-powered military-grade binoculars. He scanned the tree line with a predator's intensity, his breath hitching as he locked onto the tawny shape of Cooper crouched on a granite ledge. The binoculars didn't just magnify the image, they seemed to magnify the greed in Julian's soul, turning his eyes into dark pits of calculation. He saw the scarred shoulder, the powerful frame of a mountain lion that should have been a myth, and the sheer raw majesty of a creature that no amount of money could ever manufacture. "My God," he whispered, and for the first time his voice lacked its corporate polish, replaced by a raw, hungry tremor. He wasn't looking at an animal. He was looking at a marketing centerpiece, a trophy that would draw the world's elite to his private playground. He turned back to me, his fingers white-knuckled around the optics, and his entire demeanor shifted from a persistent salesman to a man who had found gold and intended to claim the mine. He offered me a figure that was twice what the land was worth, then triple his words, tumbling out with a desperate, frantic energy. He spoke of managing the wildlife, of securing the assets, and of the legal liabilities of having such a dangerous predator so close to human habitation. The way he used the word asset to describe Cooper made my blood boil with a heat I hadn't felt in years. I told him to get off my property, my voice low and steady, carrying the weight of the mountain itself. I told him that the only vulture I permitted in this valley was the one with feathers, and that he had 5 minutes before I considered his presence a criminal trespass. Julian Vane's face transformed, the porcelain smile, shattering to reveal a sneer of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He didn't move immediately. He stood his ground, the black SUV idling behind him like a tethered beast. He told me that men like me were relics, stubborn obstacles to the inevitable march of the modern world. He looked toward the ledge where Cooper had been, though the lion had already vanished into the thicket like a wisp of smoke, and he vowed that he would have this Thung Lung one way or another. He spoke of eminent domain of environmental lawsuits and of the many ways a private citizen could find their life becoming very complicated and very expensive. The threat wasn't whispered. It was declared with the cold confidence of a man who had never lost a fight because he always bought the judge. He climbed back into his vehicle, the heavy door closing with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid. As the engine roared and the tires spat gravel against my fence, he leaned out the window and shouted that the mountain didn't belong to the ghosts of the past, but to the people who knew how to use it. I watched the red taillights disappear into the trees, leaving behind a silence that felt bruised and fragile. The air didn't return to normal. It remained thick with the lingering scent of exhaust and the heavy, oppressive feeling of a looming siege. I knew that Julian Vane wasn't a man who took no for an answer, and that his interest in Cooper had turned a simple land dispute into a hunt. He saw a trophy to be conquered, while I saw a life that I had saved and a debt that I was still honoring. The valley felt different now, the shadows longer and more ominous, as if the forest itself were bracing for an invasion. I realized that the cameras I had found earlier were just the scouts, and that Julian Vane was the general of an army that didn't use rifles but contracts and lawyers and deep pockets. But as I looked up at the granite ledge where Cooper had stood, I knew that the mountain lion wasn't the only one with claws. I spent the rest of the evening checking the locks on my sheds and ensuring my old shortwave radio was functional, my engineering mind already calculating the defensive perimeters of my small kingdom. The piece of the Cascades had been sold in some boardroom in a city I hadn't visited in decades, and the invoice was being hand-delivered by a man who didn't understand that some things are priceless. Julian Vane had looked through those binoculars and seen a price tag on the wild, but he hadn't seen the man standing in front of him. I was 72 and my bones ached in the cold, but I had built bridges that survived, floods that wiped out entire towns. I wasn't about to let a vulture in a designer jacket tear down the only sanctuary I had left. The threat was real and it was closing in, but the debt, forged in iron and blood, was a foundation that no amount of money could ever shake. As the first stars began to pierce the velvet dark above the peaks, I felt a quiet, grim resolve settle over me. The vulture had arrived, but the mountain was still mine, and Cooper was still free. The battle for the Cascades wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the soul of the wilderness and the memory of a single withered leaf. I stood on the porch long after the sun had vanished, listening to the forest breathe, knowing that every rustle in the undergrowth could now be a friend or a foe. Julian Vane had promised to return, and I knew he was the type of man who kept his threats better than his promises. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than the highest peak in Washington. Fear is a cold sweat that starts at the base of your spine when you realize the predator is no longer the one with fur, but the one with a suit. The silence of the Cascades, which had once felt like a protective embrace, now felt like a thin veil stretched over a pit of vipers. Every morning, since that black SUV vanished into the dust, I felt the weight of unseen eyes boring into the back of my neck as I walked the perimeter of my cabin. Julian Vane had not returned in person, but his presence was a lingering sickness in the air, a spiritual exhaust that the forest couldn't seem to wash away. I began to notice the small, jagged inconsistencies in the world around me, the way the squirrels didn't chatter in the western clearing anymore, and the heavy mechanical silence that fell over the ridge just before dusk. My engineering background had trained me to look for patterns, and the pattern emerging here was one of a tactical siege, a calculated encroachment by men who viewed the wilderness as a grid to be conquered. I spent my days moving through the undergrowth with a slow, deliberate caution, my boots avoiding the dry twigs as I scanned for anything that didn't belong to the organic chaos of Washington's timberland. It was near the old creek bed, a place where Cooper often stopped to drink, that I found the first sign of the professional rot. Tucked into the hollow of a lightning-struck fir was a sophisticated acoustic monitoring device, its matte black surface absorbing the sunlight like a dark star. It wasn't just recording, it was a high-frequency sensor designed to pick up the specific low-frequency vocalizations of a large feline. A few yards away, hidden beneath a deceptively natural pile of pine needles and damp earth, I uncovered a snare. Not the crude wire loops of a local poacher, but a heavy-duty spring-loaded cable system integrated with a tranquilizer, delivery mechanism. This was the work of men who got paid more in a week than I'd earned in a year, building bridges, mercenaries of the wild who traded in trophies and high-stakes land development. They were Lung-Suk the Valley, turning the sanctuary into a laboratory of fear, and I felt a hot, focused anger bubbling in my chest that no amount of mountain air could cool. I dismantled the snare with the steady hands of a man who knew exactly how much tension a cable could hold before it snapped, tossing the high-tech components into the deep water of the ravine where they could rot in the dark. But the shadows only grew longer, and the feeling of being hunted myself became an inescapable reality that followed me into the flickering shadows of my cabin each night. Then, late on a Thursday afternoon when the sky was the color of a bruised plum, the sound of a different engine reached my ears. Not the aggressive roar of a corporate invader, but the familiar, reliable hum of a well-maintained truck. I walked out onto the porch, my hand resting on the smooth wood of the railing, to see a dusty blue pickup coming to a halt near my gate. Out stepped a woman with the same stubborn set of the jaw that I saw in my own reflection every morning. It was Elena Vance, my niece, a woman whose mind was as sharp as the legal briefs she handled for the Environmental Protection Agency. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, her eyes immediately scanning the tree line with a professional detachment that made me realize just how deep the water had become. She walked up the steps with a heavy leather satchel slung over her shoulder, her face etched with a concern that made the air in the valley feel even heavier. Elena sat at the small kitchen table, spreading out a series of documents that bore the cold official seals of government agencies and private investigators. She had been tracking Julian Vane's movements for months, following a trail of paper that led through shell companies, offshore accounts, and a history of environmental violations that spanned 3 states. She warned me that Julian wasn't just a businessman with an interest in resorts. He was a man under investigation for high-level racketeering and the illegal exploitation of protected lands. The resort was a front for a much darker enterprise, a private hunting club where the wealthy paid 6-figure sums to track the rarest predators on the planet in a controlled, illegal environment. She leaned forward, her voice a low, urgent whisper that carried the weight of impending disaster. She told me that Julian had already filed a series of bogus nuisance complaints against my property, claiming that a dangerous man-eater was a threat to public safety and that the land needed to be seized under emergency public interest laws. He was using the legal system as a scalpel to cut me out of the picture, and he was using his team of hired Thursan to provide the evidence he needed to justify the seizure. The cameras I had found were just the beginning. They were building a dossier on Cooper, documenting his visits to my porch to prove that I was harboring a threat to the community. Elena looked at me with an intensity that reminded me of her father, her words cutting through the quiet like a chainsaw. She said that if Cooper were to so much as growl at one of his men, Julian would have the legal authority to bring in a federal cull team to neutralize the problem. The threat was a pincer movement, lawyers on one side and mercenaries on the other, and I was caught in the middle with nothing but an old rifle and a debt to a mountain lion. She had come to warn me, but also to gather the evidence she needed to file a counter-injunction before Julian's influence reached the state level. We spent the night going over the maps I'd kept, marking the locations of the devices I'd found and the spots where I'd seen the flashes of lenses. The cabin felt like a war room, the blueprints of bridge building replaced by the schematics of survival and the complex geometry of legal warfare. Outside, the forest was silent, but it was a heavy, artificial silence that felt like a held breath. I knew Cooper was out there somewhere in the velvet dark, unaware that his every movement was being translated into a series of zeros and ones on a server in some city office. The gold of his fur and the amber of his eyes were being reduced to a profit margin, and my cabin was the only thing standing between him and a cage or worse. Elena's presence gave me a tactical advantage, but it also increased the stakes. If Julian were desperate enough, he wouldn't hesitate to target anyone who stood in his way, regardless of their family ties or government credentials. As the moon rose over the jagged peaks of the Cascades, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Thung Lung, I realized that the fight for the mountain had entered a new, much more dangerous phase. The predators in suits were closing in, and they were much more efficient killers than anything nature had ever produced. But as I looked at Elena, seeing the same thorn fire in her eyes, I knew we weren't going to go down without a fight. The shadows in the tree line were no longer just a mystery. They were a target. I stayed awake long after Elena had retreated to the guest room, sitting by the window with the lights out, watching the forest for the first sign of movement. The debt forged in iron and blood was now a burden that I shared with my own blood, and the leaves of the Cascades were being prepared for a storm that would wash away the weak. Julian Vane thought he was buying a resort, but he was actually walking into a Thung Lung that didn't know how to surrender. I felt the cold sweat of fear, yes, but beneath it was a bedrock of resolve that was as old as the granite beneath my boots. The hunt was on, but the vulture had forgotten one thing. A cornered man is just as dangerous as a cornered lion. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, signaling a storm that would decide who truly owned these mountains. The atmosphere in the Thung Lung became heavy and electric, a precursor to the violent descent of the Cascades' winter fury that seemed to mirror the darkness growing in Julian Vane's intentions. I could feel the barometric pressure dropping like a stone, a sensation that vibrated through the old timber of my cabin and settled deep in the marrow of my bones. As the first shards of sleet began to strike the metal roof with the staccato rhythm of small arms fire, the forest itself seemed to brace for an impact that was more than just meteorological. I wasn't just watching the clouds. I was watching the perimeter, knowing that Julian and his team of specialized Thursun would see the impending blizzard as the perfect smokescreen for their endgame. Elena Vance had positioned herself in the darkened loft with her night vision equipment and high-definition cameras. Her presence, a silent digital sentinel, prepared to capture the reality of the vulture's greed. We didn't have to wait long before the artificial hum of an engine struggling against the rising wind signaled the arrival of the hunters. They didn't come through the main gate this time. They moved like shadows along the eastern ridge, their tactical lights cutting thin, desperate paths through the swirling white chaos. I stepped out onto the porch, the freezing rain instantly coating my wool jacket in a layer of ice, and that was when the first trap was sprung. It wasn't a snare or a cage, but a calculated act of sabotage. A heavy tree trunk partially sawn through by the hunters, earlier that day, was brought down by the wind, aiming directly for the corner of the cabin where I stood. I heard the crack of the wood, a sound like a gunshot echoing through the canyon, and I realized with a jolt of terror that I was pinned by the geometry of the falling timber. Just as the massive weight of the Douglas fir threatened to crush the porch, and me along with it, a tawny blur erupted from the darkness beneath the deck. Cooper didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the risk to his own powerful frame. He lunged with an explosive force, his 150-pound body slamming into my waist and throwing me clear of the impact zone just as the roof splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The roar of the falling tree was eclipsed by Cooper's guttural snarl, a sound that carried the weight of 10 years of loyalty and the raw fury of a mountain spirit. I tumbled into the deep snow, my breath stolen by the cold and the shock. But as I looked up, I saw Cooper standing over me, his amber eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity against the backdrop of the blizzard. He wasn't just a lion anymore. He was a shield, a living counterweight to the cruelty of the men closing in. The Thursun, led by Julian's chief operative, emerged from the tree line with their tranquilizer rifles and high-voltage prods, their faces obscured by tactical masks that made them look like insects in the flickering light of my porch. They saw the lion, and they saw the man, and they saw an opportunity to finish their work under the cover of the accidental storm damage. What they didn't see was Elena, her camera lens focused and unblinking from the loft, capturing every frame of Julian Vane's voice crackling over their radio, ordering them to secure the specimen at any cost and to ignore the old man. The digital record was a cold, hard ledger of their crimes, the illegal use of restricted tranquilizers, the reckless endangerment of human life, and the violation of every federal wildlife protection statute on the books. As the hunters moved in, Cooper crouched low, his muscles rippling with a tension that felt like a drawn bowstring. He didn't retreat. He guided me back toward the safety of the interior, his presence a warm, solid wall of fur and defiance. The first tranquilizer dart hissed through the air, narrowly missing Cooper's scarred shoulder and burying itself in the splintered wood of the cabin. The hunters were desperate now, their coordinated movements falling apart under the sheer unpredictability of the storm and the fierce intelligence of the creature they sought to capture. Cooper moved with a ghost-like agility, using the wreckage of the porch as cover, flanking the men with a speed that defied their night vision goggles. He didn't strike to kill, but to disorient, his massive paws swiping at their equipment and his roars shattering their composure. I managed to get back on my feet, grabbing a heavy iron pry bar from the debris, standing shoulder to shoulder with the golden ghost I had once saved from a rusted trap. The irony wasn't lost on me. The iron had once tried to take his life, and now the iron in my hand was part of our mutual defense. In the midst of the chaos, Julian Vane's black SUV appeared at the edge of the clearing, his headlights cutting through the snow like the eyes of a demonic predator. He watched from behind the safety of his reinforced glass, his porcelain smile replaced by a mask of frustrated rage, as he saw his professional team being dismantled by an old man and a mountain lion. He screamed into his radio, his words caught by Elena's microphone demanding they take the shot, regardless of the danger to the human bystander. It was a confession of absolute moral bankruptcy, a verbal signature on his own legal death warrant. Elena's camera recorded the moment a hunter leveled a high-powered rifle, not a tranquilizer but a lethal weapon, directly at Cooper's chest. Before the trigger could be pulled, the mountain itself seemed to intervene. A massive slide of snow and ice, loosened by the storm and the vibrations of the falling tree, cascaded down the ridge, burying the hunter's primary vehicle and cutting off their path of retreat. The sudden roar of the avalanche was the final exclamation point in the night's violence. The hunters scattered in panic, their tactical superiority erased by the raw, unyielding power of the Cascades. Cooper stood his ground at the edge of the porch, his silhouette framed by the swirling white, a statue of ancient justice, watching the invaders flee into the dark. Julian Vane backed his SUV away with a screech of tires, his headlights disappearing into the grey abyss, leaving his men to find their own way out of the freezing hell they had created. The silence that followed was heavy and bruised, broken only by the whistling wind and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I turned to Cooper, seeing the snow melting on his tawny fur, and I realized that the debt was no longer a matter of accounting. It was a bond that had been forged in the iron of a trap and tempered in the fire of a life-and-death struggle. We had survived the vulture's first true strike, but the air still tasted of cold steel and treachery. Elena climbed down from the loft, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with the triumph of the evidence she held in her hands. She showed me the screen, the clear, undeniable footage of the assault, the voices of the conspirators, and the moment Cooper had saved my life. It was enough to bury Julian Vane under a mountain of litigation and criminal charges that no amount of money could ever fix. As the storm continued to howl outside, we moved into the kitchen, the warmth of the wood stove, a meager defense against the darkness of the night. Cooper didn't return to the forest immediately. He lay down across the threshold of the broken door, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving the tree line. He was the eternal guardian, the shadow of the mountain that wouldn't be bought or broken. I sat in my old chair, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, looking at the scarred lion who had become my greatest ally. The sky was still the color of a bruised plum, but the dawn was coming, and with it a new kind of reckoning. Julian Vane thought he was the hunter, but he had forgotten that the Cascades always protect their own. The storm of retribution had only just begun, and we had the records to prove that the soul of the wilderness was not for sale. The debt was being repaid in ways I could never have imagined, and as I watched Cooper's ears twitch at the sound of the receding storm, I knew that some battles are won, not with weapons, but with the quiet, unyielding power of a leaf and a life saved. In Washington, justice can be as slow as a glacier, but when it finally moves, it crushes everything in its path. The morning after the blizzard was characterized by a crystalline, unforgiving clarity, the kind of light that exposes every fracture and flaw in the world below. As the snow settled over the wreckage of my porch, the digital evidence Elena Vance had gathered during the night began its lightning-fast journey through the encrypted servers of federal agencies. The arrogance that Julian Vane had displayed, thinking that wealth was a substitute for law, started to dissolve the moment the first set of warrants was signed in a quiet courtroom in Seattle. By the time the sun had reached its zenith over the Cascades, the silence of our Thung Lung was broken once again. But not by the roar of predatory SUVs. Instead, it was the professional, orderly hum of the Washington State Patrol and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I stood on the edge of my splintered deck Cooper, having already retreated into the deep shadows of the timber, and watched as the world Julian had tried to build out of greed began to implode. The legal pincer movement Elena had orchestrated was flawless, a masterclass in environmental litigation and criminal prosecution that left no room for retreat. Julian Vane was apprehended at a private airfield just as he was preparing to board a chartered jet. The cold steel of handcuffs, a stark contrast to the designer watch he had checked so impatiently the day before. The charges were a comprehensive ledger of his moral and legal bankruptcy, multiple counts of high-level bribery of public officials, egregious violations of the Endangered Species Act, and a sophisticated scheme of illegal land acquisition through coercion and fraud. The black SUV that had once been a symbol of his untouchable power was now a piece of evidence. Its interior searched by federal agents who uncovered the tactical maps and communication logs that linked him directly to the failed assault on my cabin. Every dollar he had used to buy silence and influence was suddenly rendered useless as the Department of Justice moved with surgical precision to freeze his extensive assets, turning his empire of hedge funds and shell companies into a static, inaccessible ghost of wealth. The men he had hired, those mercenaries of the wild who had hunted Cooper like a common trophy, found themselves facing decades of federal prison time, their masks of professional indifference stripped away by the harsh light of a grand jury. The footage Elena had captured was the centerpiece of the prosecution, a visceral, undeniable record of men who had prioritized profit over the sanctity of life and the laws of the land. In the weeks that followed, the legal dust began to settle into a new, permanent landscape. The Thung Lung was not just returned to its original silence, it was transformed into a sanctuary. The title to the land officially transferred into a perpetual conservation easement under the protection of the state. My small kingdom, once an obstruction to be cleared, was now the heart of a federally recognized wildlife corridor, a place where the borders were guarded not by an old man with a rifle, but by the full authority of the United States government. The blueprints of destruction Julian had drawn up were replaced by a decree of preservation, ensuring that the Douglas firs and the granite ledges would never again be threatened by the intrusion of resorts or private hunting clubs. I watched from my rebuilt porch as the trail cameras were removed and the acoustic sensors were dismantled. The forest finally allowed to breathe without the static of surveillance. Elena stayed for a month, helping me navigate the endless paperwork and the testimonies. Her presence, a bridge between the chaotic night of the storm and the structured peace of the new era. She had used her expertise to turn a personal debt into a public legacy, proving that the fire in the Thorne blood was best used to protect the things that couldn't speak for themselves. We sat together in the kitchen one evening, the air outside smelling of fresh pine and the promise of spring, and she showed me the final court order that officially designated our home as the Silas Thorne Wilderness Preserve. It was a victory that carried no fanfare, just the quiet weight of justice finally being served to a man who thought the world was a commodity to be bought and sold. Julian Vane's name vanished from the headlines, replaced by the crushing reality of a long-term prison sentence in a federal facility where the only view of the mountains was through a narrow, barred window. He had wanted to own the Cascades, but in the end, the Cascades had simply waited for him to fail the mountain lion he viewed as a prize, becoming the catalyst for his ultimate downfall. The cost of his greed was not just financial. It was the total erasure of his influence and the permanent protection of the very creature he sought to destroy. Cooper remained a ghost, his visits less frequent but no less significant, his amber eyes still scanning the tree line for a threat that was no longer there. He seemed to understand that the air in the Thung Lung had changed, that the vibration of the engines had been replaced by the steady, reliable rhythm of the wild. The debt I had forged in iron 10 years ago had been repaid in the currency of law and the permanence of the earth, a foundation that no vulture could ever shake. I realized that my role had shifted from a guardian of a single life to a steward of an entire ecosystem, a responsibility that felt as natural as the act of building a bridge across a wide river. The mountain didn't thank me and the trees didn't bow, but as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting a golden light over the sanctuary, I felt a sense of closure that had been decades in the making. The vulture had been cast out, and the mountain was still standing, its silence a testament to the fact that some things are truly priceless. I spent my days now walking the ridges with a different kind of purpose, not looking for traps or cameras, but simply witnessing the unfolding of the seasons. The high cost of Julian's greed had paid for the eternal freedom of the Thung Lung, a transaction that the world would remember long after the names of the men involved had faded into the mist. Elena eventually had to return to her office in the city, but she left behind a legacy of protection that would outlast us both, a shield of law that was as strong as any granite wall. I stood at the gate and watched her blue truck disappear down the road, the same road that had once brought the storm. But now it only brought the wind and the occasional visit from a forest ranger. The balance had been restored, and the currency of nature was once again the only thing that mattered in the Cascades. I went back to my porch, finding a single golden leaf of a larch tree resting on the mat, a small, humble sign that Cooper was still out there honoring the contract we had signed in the snow. The justice of the mountain was slow, but it was absolute, and as I picked up the leaf, I knew that we had finally won. The Thung Lung was quiet, the air was clear, and the debt was finally beautifully settled. As the sun sets over the peaks of the Cascades, I realize that some debts are never meant to be fully paid, only remembered. The passage of time has a way of softening the sharpest edges of our memories, yet it only deepens the grooves of the bonds we forge in the crucible of survival. I am 77 now, and my stride has become a slow, rhythmic shuffle that echoes the steady pulse of the ancient forest floor. My hands, which once wrestled with frozen iron and drew up the blueprints for massive steel spans, are now gnarled and spotted like the bark of the old hemlocks, but they remain steady as I pour my morning coffee. The Thung Lung has transformed into a sanctuary of profound, echoing silence, a place where the air feels thick with the wisdom of a decade of shared existence. Cooper is no longer the lean, explosive force of nature that once terrorized the ridges. He has become a silver-maned patriarch of the high country, his movements possessing a heavy, dignified deliberation. The golden hue of his coat has faded into a dusty parchment, and the scar on his shoulder, the map of our beginning, is a stark white line that stands as a testament to every winter we have outlasted together. We are two relics of a fading era, living witnesses to a contract that was signed in blood and honored in leaves. Our ritual has reached a level of silent understanding that transcends the need for proximity or touch. He still visits the porch, but the leaps are lower now his landing, a soft thud that speaks of joints that feel the dampness of the mountain mist just as acutely as mine do. He brings his leaves the currency of a world that understands the true meaning of value, and I leave the offerings of a man who knows that he is merely a guest in a kingdom that belongs to the wild. I've learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of a profound mutual respect between two different kinds of strength. The Cascades have taught me that we do not own the land. We only borrow its silence for a time, and our only duty is to leave it better than we found it. I spend my afternoons sitting in the carved wooden chair on the porch, watching the light play across the granite ledges where Cooper often rests, his amber eyes still clear and watchful, even as the world around us changes. We have seen the seasons turn the forest from emerald to gold, and then to the stark skeletal beauty of white, each cycle reinforcing the truth that life is a gift given one heartbeat at a time. The greed of men like Julian Vane is a distant, fading echo, a momentary blemish on the face of an eternal landscape that has reclaimed its dignity. I realize now that the bridge I was meant to build wasn't made of steel or concrete, but of compassion and the willingness to see the soul behind the predator's mask. My life has been defined by the architecture of this bond, a structure that has proven to be more resilient than any suspension cable or stone foundation. Elena Vance comes to visit every few months, her truck kicking up the same dust that once heralded the arrival of the vulture, but now it brings the warmth of family and the assurance of a legacy protected. She walks the perimeter of the Silas Thorne Wilderness Preserve with a sense of pride that matches the fire in her eyes, ensuring that the legal shields she crafted remain impenetrable. We sit together in the lengthening shadows, talking about the future of the Thung Lung and the countless other creatures that now find refuge in the space we defended. She often looks toward the tree line, catching that momentary glint of amber light that signals Cooper's presence, and a soft smile touches her face. She understands that we are the guardians of a miracle, the keepers of a story that will be told long after the mountains have reclaimed our bones. As the evening chill begins to settle over the cabin, Elena often shares her thoughts on the journey we've taken, her voice a gentle melody against the backdrop of the wind in the firs. She says that true power is never found in the ability to dominate or destroy, but in the courage to protect the vulnerable and the voiceless. She believes that the world is a fragile tapestry of lives intertwined, and that a single act of kindness toward a wounded cub can change the destiny of an entire mountain. Con người chỉ thực sự mạnh mẽ khi họ biết bảo vệ những gì yêu thế hơn mình, she whispered. Last night, her words resonating with the weight of absolute truth. Humans are only truly strong when they know how to protect those who are weaker than themselves. This is the lesson that the scarred lion and the retired engineer have left for the world, a legacy of empathy that is more enduring than any monument of stone. I look out at the peaks of the Cascades, the jagged silhouettes fading into the deep violet of the night, and I feel a sense of completion that is as vast as the wilderness itself. Cooper rises from his place on the ledge, a tawny shadow dissolving into the darkness of the trees. His work as the eternal guardian of my porch finished for another day. I'm no longer afraid of the silence or the shadows. I have seen the heart of the wild, and it is a mirror of my own. The debt is not a burden but a grace, a constant reminder that we are never truly alone as long as we honor the lives that touch ours. The leaves on my porch are more than just payment. They are prayers, small tokens of a world that remembers kindness long after the iron has rusted away. I will stay here until the mountain calls me back, a steward of the light and a brother to the lion, living out the final chapters of a narrative that belongs to the earth. The Cascades will continue to breathe, the snow will continue to fall, and the story of a man and a golden ghost will live on in the whisper of the wind through the hemlocks. We are the architects of a better world, one where the lion and the man can share a porch and a sunset without the need for fear or greed. As I turn to go inside, leaving the door unlocked for the mountain air, I feel the weight of 77 years lightened by the memory of a single crimson maple leaf. The sun has set, the stars are beginning to burn through the velvet sky, and the Thung Lung is at peace. My name is Silas Thorne, and I have lived to see the day when the currency of nature became the only law of the land. The debt is remembered, the sanctuary is secure, and the eternal guardian is still out there watching over the mountains that we both call home.